Hi guys, right, this is the last one um, on one of the subjects that Andrew has brought up. Well, he hasn't brought up, he made a comment and I felt as though I had to respond to it. Now this one's about taxation. Now I don't know I know virtually nothing about medieval taxation. I know a little bit, but the first thing you've got to look at is the taxation system within England was completely, and we're looking at the medieval era, was completely different to the rest of Europe. Europe was still part of, from either, well, depending on where you were, Europe was either part of the Holy Roman Empire or was part of the Byzantine Empire. The Holy Roman Empire lasted from, I think it was about 300 AD, roughly the time they left England, left Great Britain, until about the 9th century, I believe it was, in Western and southwestern Europe. The Byzantine Empire started in started in the 9th century, I want to say, and existed all the way up until the 19th century. So it lasted for a long time. It was like a long time served empire. So, but their political systems, their taxation systems, completely different to ours. Ours started off the same as theirs in the post-Roman period, but started to change almost immediately from about the 5th century onwards. And by the time we get to the Norman conquest, it's completely different. And then it started changing again from 1066 up until the reign of Edward the First is when the biggest changes came in. So what you've got to understand is prior to Henry II, Henry III, and Edward the First, like the 1200s, the taxation system in England was based on what's called land taxes. And basically, the only people who paid tax were people who owned land. The problem with that system was that if you lived on that land, you were classed as belonging to the land and you were part of the value of the land. So you had to do as you were told. It was full-blown feudal system. Once you get to Edward I and Henry III, I think it was Henry II. Anyway, once we get to the 1250s to 1290s, and basically into the reign of Edward I, things changed drastically, and I think in some ways for the better. Edward I introduced and invented what we call today common law, which basically meant that men were their own property. You could do with your own life whatever you want. You could enter into indented servitude if you want to, basically sell yourself for a fixed length of time in return for job security, life security, that sort of thing. But there was no slavery. Slavery had been banned by William I in 1089, so there was no slavery. There was a certain amount of serfdom, but that tended to be indentured servitude rather than slavery. So it was a money contract. Not necessarily a good money contract, but a money contract. So things had changed, and so had the tax system. It changed from being a land tax to a personal value tax, as in you paid your taxes according to what you and what you could produce and what you could provide was worth. So say for instance you were a farmer, your tax burden would be based on what you could produce in any given part of the year. Now taxes were paid monthly for the most part, unless there was a particular need, for instance to pay for the Crusades or to pay for a war against the Scots or whatever, in which case you might have a tax collector saying, right, I need your next 3 months' rent paid by the end of the week. Sorry, tax paid by the end of the week. So things like that happened. But generally you paid tax on a monthly basis. Your tax year also started as it does today. This is when our financial year started, in April, because from the end of the year, from December to April in England, in the medieval era, it was generally considered too cold to travel, so the tax collectors didn't want to go out and collect taxes, and they knew that people weren't making much money anyway, so the tax year starts in April. That's when people could start moving around and things like that. Now, so that's the basic tax system. So you paid taxes based on what you were worth. So if you're a farmer, you produced £100 of potatoes, £100 of carrots, £100 of cabbages. So you produced £500 in weight of vegetables a year. You were taxed on that value. But it wasn't as simple as that. Basically, what would happen, because for the most part the chances are you were working the land for the local landowner, you would take a percentage of that profit, of that produce, usually around about 75%, and you would take that to the local manor, and then that would be counted against your tax burden. And if you were productive enough, and you were lucky enough, that might actually be your entire tax burden for the entire year. At that point, whatever you've got left, your 25% of your produce, you can do with as you please. You can sell it to make some money, some actual coin money, or you can store it away for over the winter and feed your own family with it, depending on what you want to do. The stuff that you took to the manor, to the castle, would be sold off by the landowner for money. Some of it would be used for his own personal use to feed himself and his family, and some of it would be sold on, and then the money he got for selling it would go towards paying his taxes, because he'd be paying taxes up to the next level. For instance, if your local landowner was, for instance, just a simple knight, a landed knight, he'd be paying taxes to the baron or the earl, and the earls would be paying taxes to the dukes, and the dukes would be paying taxes to the crown. Either way, and sometimes there was separation between the ranks, so you could have a situation where a baron was paying directly to the crown, depending on where you lived and who you were, but everything got paid upwards. So that's it, basic. One more example. If you're a joiner, for instance, living in a village, you might be renting a house with a workshop from your landowner, from your nobleman, and you would have to pay rent, but you might be getting part of the rent. You might even be getting the building for free, your home for free, in return for work done in the castle. Say he's building an extension to the castle, needs lots of doors and windows and things fitted. You might be getting your home and your workshop for a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long the work is going to last, for in return for doing that work. And that work you had done could be marked against your tax burden for the year or for the month or whatever. So there's lots of different ways of paying it. Now, we're talking about paying your taxes with arrows. Now, personally, I can't say for definite it didn't happen. And it definitely might have happened, probably did happen, before the reign of Edward I. The problem is, from the reign of Edward I onwards, in terms of archery equipment, arrows and bows and things, the situation changed. It became a little bit specialised. Because bows and arrows were weapons of war. And as we discussed before, Edward I was raising or setting in motion the production and the training of professional armies and soldiers within England. And part of that was a procurement campaign that was set up, in as much as he started ordering and buying up bows and arrows and having arrows made under contract. So now this is why I don't think after Edward I that you would pay your taxes in arrows, because generally speaking the vast majority of arrows that were being made under contract to the crown. So they didn't belong to you. You had already been paid for them. Yeah? So you would basically, if you went and then paid your taxes with a bunch of arrows you'd made, you would then have to replace the arrows, or if you sent a short order of arrows to the next person in the steppe or even to the Tower of London, to the Royal Armouries, you might be in trouble because you're selling produce you're selling a produced item which has already been bought. It's been bought by the king under contract. You've already received your money because from Edward I onwards and through the other Edwards and the Henrys, the War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, Fletchers, bowyers, people like that became professional tradesmen, became professional craftsmen. You became a craftsman. You became one of the new class of tradesmen. So I don't think you would be paying your taxes with arrows. Another reason for why I don't think that, I'm not saying it's not possible, but another reason I wouldn't expect you'd be paying your taxes, because arrows made, which would then, if you're giving them to the taxman paying in lieu of taxes, you're actually giving them to a government body, as it were. And in order for him to accept those arrows, they would have to meet the minimum standard required. Unless he was going to use them for personal use and then pay your taxes himself, if they were going to be paid against your tax burden, they would have to meet a certain standard. You couldn't just give him any old stick with a couple of feathers tied to it. It would have to be a usable, standardised arrow, as laid down under the military requirements laid down by the Crown. And if you were making arrows to that standard, you'd be a Fletcher, and you'd be employed by a Fletcher or as a Fletcher. So you wouldn't be paying if you were employed by a Fletcher, you wouldn't be paying your taxes using the arrows that you'd made for the Fletcher. Otherwise you'd get him in trouble and you'd be in trouble as well. So again, that's another reason why I don't think you would. However, there are connections to archery whereby you would pay your taxes with certain commodities. But let's get back to how you would pay your taxes. As I said, it was based on your value. So your work and your services and your production go towards paying your taxes. There are other things which you can collect as a commoner, which you can collect or forage or hunt, which you can use to pay your taxes. Not everything. For instance, as a commoner, you are entitled to hunt rabbits, hares, squirrel, badger, stoats, ferrets, things like that, small prey. You can hunt badger provided it's not actually in a forest set. If it's under a bush on your farm or in a local farm, you can hunt them, but not if it's in a forest. Birds, you could take as many birds as you like, of as many species as you like, with the only exception being certain swans, namely mute swans, which is the same today, but only they include a lot more swans today. Certain mute swans on certain waterways and certain rivers within the area, which were protected under Crown law. But other than that, anything's a game. So, you couldn't pay your taxes with rabbit skin or with hair, but you could pay your taxes with squirrel, believe it or not, and you could pay your taxes with badger, and you could pay your taxes with ermine. Now, ermine is the winter coat, the white winter coat that stoats have. Now, a stoat is a member of the weasel family, basically a big ferret. Wonderful creatures, I love them. But an ermine is the stoat in its white winter coat. If you capture and skin stoats, you can use the ermine pelt to pay your taxes because they are highly sought after. Why are they highly sought after? Well, the squirrel and the ermine were used for making ceremonial robes for state occasions. And even to this day, if you watch, like for instance, the state opening of Parliament, all the bigwigs, all the important people, the barons, the earls, the dukes, all them lot, the nobility, are wearing cloaks, robes that have got ermine collars on them. And those ermine collars, depending on their rank, have got squirrel tails and things like that sewn into them as well. So very important pieces of fur. And even to today, they're expensive. So you could pay badger hair. You could actually pay your taxes with badger hair as well. Even today, if you go and buy a really good quality shaving brush, chances are it would be made out of badger hair. Quite sought after. So there's 3 animals you can pay your taxes with. The other one you can pay your taxes with, and this is where the archery comes in, is goose quills. mainly because almost exclusively English longbow arrows were fletched with goose quill, and they mainly came from the grey lag goose, mainly because, and this is why a lot of medieval archery fletchings are a mixture of grey and white, because the grey lag goose has grey and white feathers on it, and they're all usable for fletching. So you were allowed to catch, kill, hunt geese, and there's plenty of them as well. During the medieval era, and even today, we have a massive natural population of grey-lag geese, even though they're now protected. But during the medieval era, there was a massive population. It was estimated that at any given time during the medieval, there was approximately 500,000, 500,000 breeding pairs of grey-lag geese on our waterways, particularly along the northeastern and the eastern coasts, in the estuaries of like the Tyne, the Wear, the Tees, the Humber. 500,000 breeding pairs. It's also the reason why, up until the 1800s, the goose was the traditional Christmas fare of the Englishman. If you went to an Englishman's Christmas Day dinner in the medieval era, chances are you would have goose, or duck, mainly goose though. But anyway, yeah, getting back to the point. So you could forage, capture, kill geese, and use their fletches, their feathers, as to pay your taxes. I don't know what the exchange rate was, but I do know that on average you needed 3 feathers, 3 quills to fletch 2 arrows. Obviously depending on the length, but a standard quill, 3 quills would do 2 arrows. But I still don't know how many quills you could actually need to pay your taxes, because I'm not entirely sure what your average person's tax would be. But there we go. So there was another tax connected to archery as well, which you wouldn't necessarily, as a commoner, you wouldn't necessarily pay it. It would only be applicable if you were importing goods into the country, into England. Say, for instance, a barrel of wine from France, depending on the size of the barrel, would have to be accompanied by at least 2 bow staves of a particular length. They had to be over 2 meters long, so 2 yards long, and of good quality yew. If you were importing, say for instance, Spanish cotton cloth, for every 10 yards, it had to be accompanied by 4 good quality yew bow staves of over 2 yards in length. Now I think there's a couple of really nice ironies to this. The most favoured bow staves that we wanted actually came from Spain, from up in the Pyrenees and places like that. And it's one of the reasons why, well, the Pyrenean foothills, it's one of the reasons why Spain today has got hardly any yew trees left at all in the entire country, because they all ended up getting chopped down and turned into bow staves and paid into England as import duties on goods being shipped into the country. Another sweet irony is that a lot of bow staves came from the south of France. And so you can guarantee that a lot of those bows that were used in the 100 Years' War against the French came from France. Because even though we were at war with France, we were still trading with countries like Portugal and Spain. And by that time, Spain was starting to run low on yew. So where did they get it from? They nipped over the border into France and cut it from French forests, and then brought it to England. So there's quite a sweet irony there that during the 100 Years' War, you can guarantee quite a few of those bows that were being used against the French by the English archers were actually of French origin. How awesome is that? Anyway, so there we go. That's a brief thing of the tax system. Now, I'm not saying that taxes weren't paid with arrows, and it depends which time period you're looking at as well. It's entirely possible that prior to 1274, when Edward came to the throne, that it was a regular thing where you paid your taxes with whatever you made, and that could include arrows, could include bows, I don't know. But after Edward, I don't think so. Anyway, hope you found that interesting. If you liked, make some comments, put some comments down below, and stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, guys.